The morning they let me go, I was wearing my father's watch. It was a Seiko he'd bought in 1987, the year he finally made foreman at the plant in Akron. He wore it every day for 22 years until his hands got too stiff to work the class. When he pressed it into my palm at my college graduation, he said, "Show up, do the work. The rest takes care of itself." I'd worn it every day for the past 19 years, through 3 acquisitions, 2 recessions, and 1 divorce that I mostly brought on myself by being exactly the kind of man who wears his father's watch to a termination meeting without realizing what's about to happen. I should have seen it coming. Looking back, I can trace every signal, every dinner where my boss went quiet when I walked in, every budget meeting where my projections got accepted without comment, instead of the usual back and forth we'd had for years. I mistook the silence for respect. It was something else entirely. My name is Walter. No, wait. I've spent 19 years conditioning myself not to be the center of any room. Let me try that again. I'm 51 years old. I spent 19 years building the regional distribution network for Caldwell Freight Solutions, a mid-size logistics company out of Columbus, Ohio that grew, under my direction, from 11 regional partners to 43. We moved pharmaceutical supplies, agricultural equipment, refrigerated goods. We had contracts with hospital systems in 6 states. I knew every operations manager by first name. I knew which routes ran thin in winter and which partners needed 30 days instead of 15 to remit. I knew this business the way a surgeon knows a patient he's operated on a dozen times, not from charts, but from the texture of it. The feel of the work in my hands. The chairman's nephew had been out of Wharton for 8 months. His name was Preston, 26 years old. He had the kind of easy competence that comes not from earning anything but from never having been told no in a way that actually cost him something. The chairman, my boss's boss, a man named Hugh Caldwell, who I'd met maybe a dozen times in 19 years, had apparently decided that Preston needed real-world leadership experience. The kind you get by being handed the title of Chief Operations Officer at a company your uncle built, while the man who actually runs the operations gets a manila folder slid across a conference table. That's how it happened. No warning. No meeting before the meeting. I walked in at 9 on a Tuesday expecting a quarterly review. Hugh was there, which should have been my first sign. Hugh was never at quarterly reviews, neither was Bev from HR, but there she was, sitting to his left with a folder closed in front of her and an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. "Walt," Hugh said. He didn't stand up. I sat down. He talked for 4 minutes. I know because I watched a second hand on my father's watch without meaning to. Something in my body understood before my brain did. He talked about the company's direction, about bringing in fresh energy, about Preston's exceptional academic background, and his vision for modernizing operations. He said the word modernizing 3 times. He never once said my name again after that first Walt. Bev slid the folder across to me. Severance terms. 19 weeks. Non-disparagement clause. COBRA information. "We appreciate everything you've built here," you said, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because he said built like it was past tense, like the 43 partners in the 6-state hospital network and the $340 million in annual contracted revenue had already been transferred to someone else's legacy, and I just hadn't gotten the memo. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I looked at the folder. I looked at Hugh. I thought about my son, who was 17 and barely talking to me because I'd missed his first 3 varsity games to handle a contract dispute with a refrigerated carrier in Indianapolis. I thought about the fact that I hadn't taken a full week of vacation in 6 years. I thought about a Sunday afternoon 2 Aprils ago when I sat in my car in the parking garage of this very building for 40 minutes after a call that could have waited until Monday, telling myself I'd make it up to my kid later. Later. "Okay," I said. Hugh blinked. I think he'd expected something else. "I'll need until end of day to clean out my office," I said. "And I'll want my personal files from the shared drive before access is revoked. I'll coordinate with IT." "Of course," Bev said too quickly. I stood up. I shook Hugh's hand because my father raised me to shake hands. I walked back to my office. I closed the door. I sat in my chair, the chair I'd sat in for 11 years in this particular office, though I'd had 3 different ones before it in 2 previous locations. And I looked out the window at the parking structure across the street. And for the first time in a very long time, I had absolutely nothing I needed to do in the next 10 minutes. It was the quietest moment of my career. I used it carefully. Here's what nobody outside of logistics contract law would know, and what Preston Caldwell certainly did not know when he showed up on his first Monday with a standing desk insert and a reusable coffee cup that said, "Disrupt everything," 7 years ago during our expansion into the Southeast. I'd negotiated the contracts with our 12 largest carrier partners myself. This was back when we were smaller, when the legal team was one overworked attorney named Don, who freely admitted he didn't know freight law the way I did. I'd structured those 12 contracts with what I called a relationship continuity clause, not unusual in partner agreements, but the specific language I'd used was mine. The clause stated that if the primary operations contact, defined specifically by name and title, departed the company without a 90-day transition period, each partner retained the right to suspend their contract pending a 30-day review with new management. No penalty, no breach, just a pause, a meeting, and a mutual decision about whether to continue. I'd written it that way to protect the partners. At the time, I was worried about what would happen to them if we got acquired, and some corporate integrator came in and restructured everything overnight. I wanted them to have an exit door that didn't cost them anything. I put it in every major contract for 3 years running. Legal reviewed them. Legal approved them. Legal, to be honest, probably didn't fully understand what they were approving because Don trusted me and the language was buried in Section 14 of documents that ran 60 pages. I was the primary operations contact, defined specifically by name and title in 31 active contracts. When I was terminated without notice or transition period, those clauses became active. I did not call anyone. I did not send emails. I did not, as some people might imagine in this situation, compose a dramatic letter to the board. I went home. I mowed my lawn, which I hadn't done in 3 weeks. I grilled a chicken breast. I watched the last half of a baseball game. I slept better than I had in months. My phone started ringing on Wednesday. Preston's first major decision as COO came on day 4. I know this because one of the regional managers, a man named Gus, who'd worked with me for 11 years and who texted me from a personal cell phone like we were exchanging football scores, sent me a 3-sentence message that I read standing in my kitchen in sweatpants at 7 in the morning. He canceled the Morrison medical contract, said the margins were thin, wants to reprioritize to higher yield commercial routes. I set down my coffee. Morrison Medical was one of our hospital system partners. Refrigerated pharmaceutical supply chain for 4 regional hospitals in Tennessee. Thin margins, yes, but it was also the anchor contract that had brought us 2 other hospital systems as partners, both of which cross-referenced our Morrison relationship as a trust signal during their own due diligence. It was also the contract that, per our carrier partner in Nashville, constituted 30% of their annual revenue with us. I did not call Gus back. I sent him a thumbs-up emoji and went for a walk. What happened next happened without me. The Nashville carrier, whose contract with us contained one of my continuity clauses, received no transition call from Preston, no introduction, no acknowledgement that the man they'd worked with for 9 years was gone, and a new person was now their point of contact. What they received was an automated email from a new company domain address introducing Preston Caldwell, COO, and informing them of a revised payment schedule extending their remittance window by 45 days. They activated their clause. They sent a formal suspension notice to Caldwell Freight Legal on Thursday morning. By Friday, 2 more partners had followed, not because they were angry, but because when the Nashville carrier called their counterparts in Memphis and Charlotte to ask if they'd heard from anyone at Caldwell, those partners checked their own contracts, found the same language, and decided a 30-day pause while they figured out what was happening sounded like a reasonable idea. I learned about this the way you learn about a storm that's already passed, from the aftermath. Gus texted me again on Friday night. 2 words, it's bad. By the following Wednesday, 11 partners had filed suspension notices, not terminations, suspensions. They weren't leaving, they were waiting. They wanted to meet with someone who could explain what was happening. Preston, from what I understood secondhand, had responded to the first few with conference calls that did not go well. He knew the financials. He did not know the relationships. He did not know that the man who ran the Memphis operation had a daughter who'd interned with us 2 summers ago and that I'd written her recommendation letter. He did not know that the Charlotte partner had called me personally in 2019 when their primary driver had a health crisis, and I'd covered their route personally through a subcontractor for 2 weeks while they sorted it out. He did not know any of it because it wasn't in a spreadsheet. Hugh Caldwell called me on a Thursday morning, 11 days after he'd slid that manila folder across the table. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later. I listened to the message. His voice was different than it had been in that conference room. Tighter. Faster. Walt, I'd like to sit down and talk. I think there's been some miscommunication with our partners and I'd value your perspective. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. Miscommunication. I sat with that word for a while. Then I called my attorney. I need to tell you something about my attorney because this matters. His name is Elliot, and I've known him for 12 years, and he is exactly the kind of man who waits, not passively, actively. He doesn't make noise when silence is more expensive for the other side. When I called him and explained what was happening, he was quiet for about 15 seconds, which for Elliot is the equivalent of a standing ovation. The clauses are valid, he said, and you did nothing to trigger them. You were terminated. Correct. And you've had no contact with any of the partners since termination? None. Another pause. Walt, do you know what you have here? I think I do. You have leverage. Clean, legal, unimpeachable leverage, and you didn't manufacture it. They handed it to you when they walked you out the door without a transition plan. He paused. What do you want? That was the question I'd been sitting with since I mowed my lawn. What I wanted was not revenge exactly. Revenge is hot. What I wanted was colder than that. I wanted what I had built to be acknowledged. I wanted my son to see that his father's work meant something, and I wanted to walk back into a room with Hugh Caldwell with something he needed. I want a consulting contract, I said. 18 months. My rate plus 30%. And a formal acknowledgement, in writing, of my role in building the partner network. Not for PR, for the record. Elliot made a sound that might have been a laugh. I'll draw up the terms. The meeting with Hugh was nothing like the first one. He stood up when I walked in. That told me everything about how the last 2 weeks had gone. Preston was not in the room. Bev from HR was not in the room. It was Hugh and his personal attorney and me and Elliot, and the energy in that room was the inverse of what it had been 11 days ago. Hugh looked tired. Not the tired of a long day, the tired of someone who has spent a week watching something he built start to crack and couldn't explain to himself why it was happening. He'd built this company over 30 years. He'd handed the operational heart of it to a 26-year-old because of blood, and now 11 carrier partners were sitting in a 30-day suspension window waiting to find out if Caldwell Freight was still the company they'd trusted. I didn't gloat. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me. My father never gloated. He used to say that gloating was for people who needed other people to feel small. I didn't need that. I sat down. I put a folder on the table, my folder this time, and I slid it across to Hugh's attorney. These are my proposed consulting terms, I said. 18 months, structured as an independent contractor engagement. I'll manage the partner relationship restoration and the transition plan for whoever ultimately takes over operations permanently. In exchange, I want formal documentation of my contribution to the partner network's development, and I want my non-disparagement clause voided mutually. Hugh's attorney reviewed it. Hugh looked at me. Walt, he said, and this time he said it differently. I owe you an apology. I let him give it. He meant it, I think. Or he meant it as much as a man in his position can mean something like that. He talked about Preston, that it hadn't worked out the way he'd hoped, that Preston was being reassigned to a role better suited to his current experience level, which I translated as, he's getting a different title and a different office and a graceful exit from the one he never should have had. Hugh talked about the company, about what it meant to him, about the partners, about his responsibility to the people who'd built it. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, I'll have everything stabilized within 60 days. The partners just need to hear a consistent voice and a coherent plan. They're not leaving. They never wanted to leave. They just needed a pause button. We signed that afternoon. The 60 days were actually 47. I called every partner personally in the order I'd known them longest. Some of those calls lasted 5 minutes, some lasted an hour. The man in Nashville who I'd worked with since his company had 12 trucks and now had 63, asked me straight out why I'd left. I told him the truth in the most professional way I knew how, which was to say that a leadership transition had happened faster than anyone had anticipated, and that I was back in an advisory capacity to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. Good, he said, because no offense to the young man, but he called me about payment schedules before he'd even asked my name. I know, I said, that won't happen again. It didn't. By the end of 47 days, 30 of the 31 suspended partners had reactivated. The 31st, a smaller carrier in western Kentucky, had used the suspension window to sign with a competitor, which was their right, and honestly I couldn't blame them given the timing. 30 out of 31 was not a number I was ashamed of. My documentation of the partner network, who built what, when, through what relationships, at what cost, went into the company's permanent record. Not a press release, not a LinkedIn post. A document, filed, time-stamped. There, if anyone ever needed to look. There's something I haven't talked about yet. On the third Saturday after I'd been let go, before any of this had resolved itself, I drove to my son's lacrosse game. He was a junior. I'd missed, I think, about 60% of his games over the past 3 years. He knew I was coming because I'd texted him, and he'd replied with an okay that I chose to read as cautiously optimistic. I sat in the bleachers with the other parents. I didn't have my laptop. I didn't have a work phone anymore. I had a cup of gas station coffee and my father's watch, and nowhere else I was supposed to be. My son, his name is Ryan, and he has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is not a combination that makes adolescence easy, spotted me from the field during warm-ups. He didn't wave, but he looked. That was something. He scored twice. His team lost by 1, which hurt him, you could see it. But he played well, and he knew it. Afterward, I waited by the parking lot the way the other parents did, and when he came out of the locker room and found me still there, he stopped walking for just a second. You stayed, he said. I stayed, I said. We went and got burgers. We didn't talk about work, which was probably the first time that it happened at a meal between us in 3 years. He told me about his friend's car problems and a teacher he found frustrating, and a girl in his AP history class who he mentioned twice in a way that suggested she wasn't just a girl in his AP history class. I listened. Just listened. Driving home, he said, "Are you going to be okay with the job stuff?" "Yeah," I said. "It's going to work out." "How do you know?" I thought about the clauses in 31 contracts. I thought about Elliot saying clean, legal, unimpeachable. I thought about Hugh standing up when I walked into the room. "Because I built something real," I said, "and real things don't disappear just because someone stops looking at them." He didn't say anything to that, but he nodded, the way teenagers nod when they've heard something they're not ready to agree with yet but can't quite argue against either. That was enough for me. Preston Caldwell, as far as I know, took an operations analyst position at a supply chain software company in Austin. I don't say this with satisfaction. He was 26 and was handed something he wasn't ready for by someone who loved him and didn't understand what he was asking. That's not Preston's fault. That's the story of nepotism. It damages the person who receives it almost as much as the people around them. because it puts them in a room they can't fill, and then wonders why there's so much empty space. I finished my consulting engagement 7 months into the 18-month contract. The partner network was not just stable. 3 new regional carriers had signed during that period, 2 of them referrals from existing partners who'd apparently told them that Caldwell Freight had its act back together. I submitted my final report on a Tuesday. Elliot confirmed the documentation was properly filed. I returned the company laptop, kept the parking pass for my last week, and left. This time I chose the day. That mattered more than I expected it to. I'm doing something different now, a smaller operation, consulting independently for regional logistics companies, mostly the kind that are growing fast and need someone who's seen what happens when you scale too quickly without protecting the relationships underneath the contracts. It's half the income it was at the peak. I work from home 3 days a week. I've been to every single one of Ryan's games this season, including the one in the rain 2 weeks ago when I stood on a muddy hillside in a jacket that was not remotely waterproof and watched him play the best quarter of lacrosse I've ever seen him play. He waved at me from the field during warm-ups. Just once, quick, like he didn't want his teammates to see. But he did it. I think about my father a lot these days. About what he meant when he said, "Show up, do the work, the rest takes care of itself." I used to think the rest meant promotions, recognition, titles. I spent 19 years chasing that version of the rest. I understand it differently now. The rest is the wave from the field. The rest is Ryan asking me about my day over burgers and actually waiting for the answer. The rest is driving home on a Tuesday evening with nowhere I urgently need to be, watching the light go gold over the highway, wearing my father's watch, finally understanding what he was trying to tell me. I built something real. In the end, it held. That's the whole story. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not just the termination, not just the contracts, but the whole 19 years leading up to that Tuesday morning. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nobody forced me to build those relationships the way I did. Nobody told me to learn the names of my partner's kids, to cover a route in Memphis when a driver got sick, to write a recommendation letter for a girl who'd interned with us one summer. I did all of that because I understood something early in my career that took me a long time to put into words. That underneath every contract, every shipment, every smitment, every spreadsheet, there are human beings who are betting on you. And the only currency that actually holds its value in this business, in any business, is whether people can bet on you and win. Preston wasn't a bad person. I want to say that clearly because it matters. He was a 26-year-old who got handed a position he hadn't earned and couldn't have known how to fill. The damage Hugh caused wasn't just to me. It was to Preston, too. You can't give someone a title as a substitute for experience and then be surprised when experience turns out to be the one thing the title can't replace. That's not fresh thinking. That's just wishful thinking with a nicer office. What happened to Caldwell Freight in those 11 days wasn't revenge. I didn't make a single call. I didn't coach anyone. I didn't need to. The partners acted on their own because I had spent years building something that was real, and they could feel the absence of it the moment it was gone. That's what real work does. It leaves a shape in the space around it. When it's removed, people feel the cold. I think about my father a lot in relation to all of this. He worked the plant floor for 22 years. He never had stock options or a corner office or a title that made people straighten up when he walked in. What he had was a reputation for showing up and doing exactly what he said he would do, every single time without making a production of it. And when he retired, the men he'd worked with came to his house. They sat in his backyard. They told stories about specific moments, times he'd covered for someone, times he'd stayed late, times he'd said the quiet, honest thing when it would have been easier to say nothing. That was his legacy, not a number on a contract, a room full of people who remembered. I spent a long time chasing the wrong version of that. I thought if I built something big enough, impressive enough, profitable enough, it would speak for itself. And it did, eventually. Just not in the way I expected. It spoke loudest when someone tried to take it away and couldn't, because 19 years of real relationships don't transfer in a handshake and an automated email about revised payment schedules. Ryan asked me once if I was going to be okay. I told him yes because I believed it. But what I didn't say, what I'm still learning how to say, is that the version of me that was okay turned out to be a better version than the one who'd been working 80-hour weeks and missing his lacrosse games. That version was impressive on paper. This one shows up to games in the rain and stands on muddy hillsides and watches his kid play the best quarter of lacrosse he's ever played. My father was right. Show up. Do the work. The rest takes care of itself. I just finally understand which rest he meant.